In the fall of 2012, I was 19 and home visiting my family from college for a long weekend. I grew up in a small town in Utah, and in our very small town, there was an old cemetery that was supposedly haunted. Now, I never really believed in that sort of thing and never gave it much thought or interest. So despite growing up about a mile from the cemetery, I had actually never been to it. In school, we learned a lot about the pioneer history that was tied to our small town, so I was aware that the cemetery had a very old section of tombstones with plots dating back to the mid-1800s. That weekend I was back, I spent a lot of time with my brother Jeremy. Jeremy was a couple years younger than me, a junior in high school, and we were always very close. One night, we were hanging out with a couple of neighbor friends we had grown up with on the same block. Their names are Justin and Adam, and both were seniors in high school at the time. We spent the night with a little fire in the backyard, catching up until it had gotten late. Eventually, somehow, we had gotten on the topic of ghost stories, and that cemetery came up. Adam told us that a few of his friends had gone up during the summer and had seen an old pioneer woman walking between the gravestones, and then she had just vanished behind an old mausoleum. Adam and Justin both wanted to go up, so we thought, why not? It's late and we were running out of wood to burn. It was early October and the nights were cold, so I grabbed the keys to my mom's minivan to drive the mile to the edge of the town where the cemetery is. The cemetery is up on a hillside, so I parked on the street along the edge of the hill. None of us had been there before, so we really didn't know what we were looking for. We pulled out our cell phones for the flashlights and wandered through the headstones, scanning names and dates. Eventually, we came to the old section of the cemetery. We were able to easily identify it as such because it had an old metal fence about knee-high blocking off a rather large section of gravestones. Now, the cemetery wasn't small, but also wasn't massive, so despite us being on the far side at the top of the large hill, we could still look down and see the street where we were parked with our minivan under the street lamp in the distance. As we entered the old section, me and my brother Jeremy stayed close and went to one end, and Adam and Justin went in the opposite direction. None of us were saying much, just looking around among the tombstones and reading what information we could that wasn't worn with time. Justin and Adam were now at the mausoleum on the furthest side of the cemetery when we heard them start yelling to try and provoke a spirit. They yelled, "Where are you old hag?" among other worse insults. They then took turns peeing on the mausoleum and nearby headstones as they yelled and tried to provoke the spirits even further. Me and Jeremy weren't okay with this and thought it would serve them right to play a joke and make them walk home. So we slipped away and made it down to the minivan as the other two were distracted. We hurried and started the engine and pulled away quickly to not give them a chance to catch up. To get home, we had to pull into and go through an alleyway that was directly to our right. As we rounded the turn to enter the alley, we noticed an old woman with her back turned to us. She was dressed in old raggedy looking clothing, something like you'd see on Little House on the Prairie. She wasn't fazed by the headlights and didn't even seem to notice our car coming up behind her. She was slowly moving forward with her head down, still facing away from us, with her broom in her hand, just sweeping back and forth, as she slowly inched her way forward. We were still laughing about leaving our buddies back in the cemetery, and weren't comprehending how weird of a situation this was. We didn't think to ourselves, why is this old woman sweeping the street at what was now around 2:30 a.m. in the morning, in the freezing cold? Our laughter at leaving our friends quickly became frustration with this lady, who was in the middle of the alley, oblivious to the fact that we needed to get by. So, with my patience running thin, I pulled to the right and popped both passenger side tires of our minivan onto the sidewalk in order to inch past this woman who refused to get out of our way. We are pulling up right behind her now, and still, she doesn't even acknowledge we are there. Now, we are inching right beside her, and I look out my driver's side window. We are so close to the woman that I was most concerned about making sure my side mirror doesn't clip her. as I inch past her, focusing mainly on the mirror, not wanting to knock her over. Her head slowly turns sideways and comes face to face with mine through the thin piece of glass. And as we make eye contact, a hauntingly eerie smile spread across her face. I still get goosebumps thinking about that look on her face and how the hair on the back of my neck stood up when we locked eyes. She continues, never missing a beat with her sweeping, and I got the overwhelming feeling something wasn't right with this woman. As soon as we cleared her, we got off the sidewalk and booked it home, both of us silent, not knowing what we had just witnessed, or why we felt the way we did because of it. Neither of our first thoughts were of her being a ghost because she looked as real as both of us. However, there was something just off about her, and neither of us could shake the disturbing feeling we were left with. We get back to the fire pit and burn through the last of our wood. About 30 minutes later, Justin and Adam show up and blurt out, "What the hell, man?" they said. "Why did you leave us, and why haven't you been picking up your phones?" We both looked at our phones, and both seemed to be working fine, but no missed calls, which was strange because we've never had any issues with service in our town, and especially not at our house. We told them about the old woman sweeping, and they didn't know what we were talking about. They said they were coming down the hill as soon as they saw us pulling away and realized we were leaving them. And they saw us going down the alley. They could even clearly see down the entire alley from up on the hill and were confused why we drove up on the sidewalk and why we were going so slow. My heart sank when they said they were confused because there was no one else in the alley with us. We were completely alone.
I was that stereotypical high school emo girl with the Ouija board permanently in the trunk of her car. I was always ready to play at any given time during one of our adventurous night excursions. When we were bored and wanted to get spooked, we have about 5 extremely old and rundown cemeteries within 20 miles of my small Pennsylvanian town, and we would usually end up in one of them. I was well aware of the rules of the board, so definitely not just some dumb kid. I just loved to be scared. So I was around 18, this was in 2006, and on one of our onboard Let's Go Explore Barclay Cemetery excursions, we planned to be there and to play at midnight. A little backstory. Barclay was a mining town during the 1800s. Most of the population was wiped out by diphtheria. There are even reports of residents being buried alive to contain the spread, along with a bunch of other creepy, terrible things. The cemetery at that point was not much more than a wooden archway with Barclay carved into it, with run-down, tipped-over, broken gravestones, along with the leftover rock foundation of the small church. The graves were also raised due to the ground settling and many holes dug by animals, often right in front of the gravestones. Anyway, me and about 2 carloads of friends show up armed with flashlights. Flashlights tend to die quickly while in this cemetery, so backup candles were also ready on standby. We were early, it's not midnight yet. We walk around, giggle, and scare each other. The cemetery is always silent. There's no noise, not even animals to be heard. It really sets the tone as a creepy place. We find a tall column-type gravestone that is knocked over on its side and would make the perfect table for our Ouija board. As you approach the knocked-over gravestone, the writing is not visible. We are on the edge of the graveyard. To our back is the forest where the church foundation remains. We set up our board. My best friend and I sit side by side, our backs to the forest, facing the entrance. We start with the typical, "Is there anyone there?" It answers yes. "What is your name?" "Sarah." "How old are you?" 23. "Were you married?" "Yes." "Any kids?" "Yes, one." At this point, we hear 2 footsteps coming from the forest directly behind us. Now keep in mind we've been to this cemetery on many occasions before, and always make note of the dead silence without ever hearing birds or owls even. All our friends are in front of us with flashlights pointed at the board. The first flashlight dies. That friend is done. "F this," she says, and back to the car she goes. We continue. We ask a few random questions, get answers. Then we hear 2 more steps taken towards us. We hear the leaves rustle and a stick break. The footsteps stop. We look, shine lights, there's nothing. We start whispering amongst ourselves, speculating. As we are looking towards the forest, 2 more steps. Honestly, to best describe the steps, it felt and sounded like a curious kid who's afraid to get too close. Okay, well now they are too close. We get nervous and we say goodbye to Sarah. We've succeeded in getting our scare, but as we are about to run back to the car, I'm curious. Whose grave were we sitting on? The name faces the ground on the forest side of the tombstone. We couldn't see it when we sat down. My best friend and I go check it out and lean down below the leaning gravestone to see if we can make out anything. Gravestone read, Sarah Strange, wife of Morris Strange, 23 at death, mother. Had baby's birth and death date, the same date. The baby did not live more than 1 day. Our board had all the info correct. We had not visited this stone before. Despite being in the graveyard multiple times, we generally stayed clear of the church area. We then ran to the car and got out of there. I've been back many times. I always take note to visit Sarah when I'm there. I've had some strange, scary, inexplicable things happen to me in my childhood, but this event will forever haunt my existence. I was 13 years old at the time when my best friend, we'll call her Sarah, and 2 other boys in our grade decided to hang out in town. We grew up in a small town in New Jersey, where there wasn't much to do besides hang out at local parks and such in the area. We decided to walk to this one park on a lake that sits at the bottom of a large wooded hill. On top of the hill is a cemetery. It was broad daylight in the early afternoon, and we decided to just take a walk through the cemetery and thought nothing of it. My best friend was wiping off debris from tombstones and monuments in an effort to respect the dead. We were reading the gravestones and speaking aloud the names of the deceased individuals. It was actually really peaceful. The 4 of us decided to sit in a patch of grass a little ways away from the graves to relax after walking around. We naturally sat in a circle formation and Sarah was next to me to my left. We were engaged in conversation when I suddenly noticed Sarah had gone really quiet. I looked over at her and she was staring off into nothing. I immediately asked her if she was okay and she sort of snapped out of it and said yes, she's fine. A minute or so later she was staring into space again and she covered her ears. I asked what was going on and she said, I can't hear, they're screaming at us. Now I'm terrified and I ask who is screaming. She doesn't respond and starts to rock back and forth. My heart is beating out of my chest. I call her name again and I instinctively throw my cell phone, a bulky NV2, right at her head, and she didn't even flinch. She rocked back and forth for a few more seconds before looking down into her lap. She then looks up at me with the most evil, demonic smile. Her face was fixed in an expression I've never ever seen her make, and so it didn't even look like her face. Immediately, I knew she was possessed. This was my absolute worst nightmare come true, and I was terrified to my core. There are no words to describe the overwhelming amount of fear that consumed me. My fight or flight response kicked in and I just blacked out. I came to a few seconds later and found myself about 100 feet away from her and the boys. She was still staring at me, smiling, completely still, not even blinking. I was screaming and crying her name and I was frozen with fear. She finally broke her demonic gaze from me, looked back into her lap, got up and ran away right into the woods. It took me a few seconds to unfreeze and I came to the realization that she was in danger and I needed to go after her. I ran and grabbed my cell phone and followed her into the woods, down the hill, and to the park area where I find her sitting on a swing. I approach her and I ask if she's okay. She's extremely disoriented and asks, "Where are we? We need to stay. We need to go back." I said, "No way in hell are we staying. We need to get the hell out of here. I literally have to drag this girl out of the park." The park and cemetery are located on Native American grounds. There was a group of people at the park for a cultural event who asked us if we were okay and if one of us had screamed. I just said yes, it was me, but everything is fine. When we got out of there, we all just had a what the hell just happened moment of silence. Sarah did not remember anything that happened. She said she remembers sitting down with us on the grass, and she remembered the voices screaming at us and that they were telling us to leave. Then she said she felt like she was having a nightmare and was dreaming of what she assumed to be hell because there was fire everywhere. She didn't recall saying she wanted to stay at the park or being dragged out. The boys were speechless and didn't really have much to add. From that day on, I would have demonic nightmares 4 to 7 nights a week until my freshman year of college. The nightmares would always involve a possession or extremely dense, heavy air that signified a demonic presence. I was always weighed down by the energy and could barely get away in time when in my dream, I realized the demon was present. I'm still friends with this girl to this day, and we have only mentioned it a handful of times. My logic was if I ignored it or didn't speak it into existence, it would go away. Eventually it did. Once in a great while, I will get the nightmares. To this day, I can't help but wonder if I was haunted by the demon after the incident, or if it was just some severe PTSD.